The world came to an end in a different way. And so we have not actually had an in-person, face-to-face gathering of the sort. So we hope we have many more. So that part of it is frankly exciting. And the other is just inaugurating a series that is focused on the thought and the leadership that can come with thought. So it cannot tell you how important it is that as DhiA has evolved, we have tried to bring together 4 faiths that were born in India: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and trying to take those faiths and capture the essence of them and, in a sense, make them relevant to the people living in the United States, particularly young people. That was our mission when we started. And we have now ended up focusing on youth engagement, on women, and what Dharma and how they are adapting, particularly in the area of finance, and becoming self-sufficient, self-capable, if you will, and then in meditation and mindfulness. And that program in particular has really caught a thread, because in all our 4 faiths, if there's one thing that runs through it, it is managing your mental health. And think about COVID and think about what everybody went through, men, women, and children across the globe, and how much those lessons and those practices adapted to today, propagated correctly with the right focus and thesis, can help humanity. And that is our mission, really, is to not just figure out the answer, but to figure out how the best practices and how to put that into effect with pilots and then export it so that anyone, anywhere bothers to learn and we can adapt it. So today is just a really great day. It's an exciting day. And we are particularly happy because we have with us today somebody who is actually in many ways both an intellectual and somewhat a philosopher. So he may be mild spoken, but I think his thoughts are very large. Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta is somebody who many people in India may know. I hope that partly with these efforts that many people in the United States will know him as well. He's, of course, studied extraordinarily. He studied at Oxford. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton. He was the first cohort of graduate student fellows at the Center for Human Values. He now actually is here as a visiting professor at Princeton University, which is how he came to us from New Jersey. And prior to that, he was vice chancellor at Shekar University, which is close to Delhi in the national capital region. But before that, Jawaharlal Nehru University, global faculty at NYU Law. Importantly, he is widely written about political theory, and this is intriguing, Dr. Mehta, the history of ideas, Indian constitutional law and politics in India. He's going to get a few questions today from us about politics in the US, because we want to learn from how he thinks of it, both as an insider and an outsider. He's the author of The Burden of Democracy and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook to the Indian Constitution. So he's also writing something about philosophical ideas about religion in 20th century India. So a fellow of the British Academy and SSRC fellow for 2020. So he's worked in a variety of roles in public service as well. So I want to just quickly mention convener of the Prime Minister of India's Knowledge Commission, member of India's National Security Advisory Board, and then in journalism, editorial consultant to Indian Express, and published in the Financial Times and Foreign Affairs and other dailies. I saw Dr. Mehta in India because my father-in-law, was a great fan of his. And the one time in the evening at dinner table, he would say, shh, would be because Dr. Mehta was appearing on television. And I asked him why he said that, why he had such particular reverence. And he said, because he has something to say. He'll say it clearly. You may not like it, but if you think about it, there might be a grain of truth that you can at least think about it. So that is what we are hoping to do, Dr. Mehta, is to find those grains of truth in a very civic dialogue, which is conduct it civilly with both people in the audience. So ground rules quickly. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mehta to open and let's open this conversation. If you are online, you're welcome to put questions in the chat room, and Rohit is here monitoring that, and he will raise them. Of course, if you're sitting here, most welcome to raise your hand and ask a question at any time. I have plenty, so we will not be bored. But with that, thank you so much for being here. It's our pleasure to have you and to take the time. Dr. Mehta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shekarji. It's an incredible privilege to be here, and I must confess, a little intimidating as well. I think there's a special responsibility for on the shoulders of somebody who speaks first in a series as distinguished as what DhiA in action is promising. And I've just been overawed this morning hearing about the kind of work you have been doing, really going to the heart of difficult spiritual, moral, and political questions. I think very new and creative ways. So I think I'm mindful of the task ahead of us. The topic Shekharji suggested to me, was a bit mischievous. It's faith and politics, and these are topics that, if you speak on individually on faith or on politics, are of course fraught, particularly these days. Both of them incite a certain kind of passion. But if you conjoin the two, the results can actually be quite explosive. I also feel a little bit sort of intimidated by the topic for, I think, one very particular reason. I'm a political scientist, so it's not stock in trade to talk about politics. So as you know, political scientists don't really understand politics. They understand certain things about it. But it's also a bit intimidating talking about faith. I think that word is used too lightly, and understandably so. It's a placeholder for lots of different things. It can be a placeholder for personal beliefs. It can be a placeholder for organized religion. It can be a placeholder for a certain kind of quest. But what I find particularly, I think, important to stress at the outset, and we will come to the connection between faith and politics in a second, why it is difficult, or it should be difficult to talk about faith. One of the great things about all the Indian dharmic traditions is the central term that is important to almost all of them is not dharma. It's not karma, or whatever you've actually heard as your favorite adjective. It's actually Shraddha. If you pick up the Devi Mahatmya, this temple has the text on its website where we are located, the Shiv Vishnu temple. If you pick up the Bhagavad Gita, right, which has a striking phrase, Shraddha Mam Pusho. And what that basically says is, you are your faith. So when you're talking about faith, you're not just talking about, in a sense, a set of beliefs, a set of marketable commodities and products, a set of organizations and institutions. Shraddha is, in a sense, a fundamental orientation you have to the world that in some sense is defined. Without Shraddha, in some senses, nothing is possible. So in that sense, I think faith is actually much more foundational in this deep sense of Shraddha. But it also makes it much more complicated, because if you ask the question, why do people have the kind of faith they do? In whatever faith things they do have faith. It could be a very quotidian thing, like how do you have faith in your friend? Right? Let's start with those quotidian things. And then ascending to, in some senses, a much larger canvas. The honest answer is that it's hard to give a very general account of that. And one reason I'm very queasy about faith talk in public is, if you reflect on your own experiences here, your faith will be a product of lots of things: your upbringing, your epiphanies, your chance encounters. If you're speaking in a dharmic tradition, your sanskar and your prarabdha. Right? And the astonishing thing about any genuine religion, right? Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Sikhism, all these Indian religions, is that at their core, they have to recognize that individuality. Now, what faith in its public form does, first and foremost, is it bridges away that individuality. It tries to name you. You are Hindu, you are Sikh, you are Jain. What do those terms mean? Are those terms that somebody else will define for you? Or are those terms which in some senses you come to comprehend through your own journey? What has happened to, in a sense, all our organized faiths, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, Sikh, all Indian religions in some ways, is they have become marketable commodities, they have become political identities, and what is missing from it is that astonishing regard for individuality, which is at the core of all of these faiths. Notice one thing about any saint, pick anyone, pick Shankar, pick Guru Nanak, pick a Chishti saint. They will never criticize you for being who you are. A saint never engages in schism, never tries to define a boundary. The minute you ask the question, who are you? And can who you are be encapsulated in a name? Hindu, Sikh, Jain, or even if you give it a slightly more expansive definition, Indic, you have already abridged the self. There's nothing more imprisoning than a name, nothing more in some senses suffocating than a name. Because you immediately say, you are Hindu, it must mean A, B, C, or D. But if it already must mean A, B, C, or D, how can it be a spiritual quest? How can it take into account that individuality that constitutes who you are and that boundlessness that constitutes who you are? So notice a saint never disagrees with another saint. A guru will, a leader of a religious sect will. Right? Somebody who mobilizes religions for political purposes will. A saint will never say, right, become this or become that. Notice another thing about genuine faith, at least the sense in which we understand it. There is an incredible lightness of touch about it. Go back to the term Shraddha, which we began with, right? What is Shraddha? Shraddha is a sense of basic trust in the world. What is religion at its heart? A sense of basic trust in the world. If you have lost that basic sense of trust in the world, you are in some senses faithless. What we see around us is a lot of religiosity, but very little genuine faith. Think of the other characteristics of that faith. I mean, the hallmarks, how would you recognize someone's faith? As I said, the basic sense of trust in the world. I have no reason to be suspicious. If I cannot orient myself to that attitude, I fundamentally don't have faith. That's the faith very few saints have had. None of our kind of gurus do. The second element of faith is the only way it works is by exemplarity. It never exercises authority over it. To use a sentence from another American Vedantin, Emerson, one soul can give another soul only a provocation, never instruction. The minute you say you're about to instruct, you've already presumed you know something about somebody else. You've already presumed that they are, in a sense, a finite being you can comprehend. third thing about genuine faith is that if you have genuine trust in the world, it will always be playful. Think of Kabir, think of Nanak. Right? Well, the thing that stands out most is an incredible sense of playfulness. Right? Somebody prevents Nanak from entering, a masjid. He says, okay, God is everywhere, masjid is right here. I mean, there's no rancor, there's no resentment. One of the greatest, I think, articulators of the Dharmic tradition, who's the greatest tantric, the greatest Shaiv scholar, if you want to use these categories, I think these categories are quite permeable. Abhinav Gupta, right? He's this incredible line, Mam kimchit tyaj mam grihanam vilasa swasthoya vyastitah. What is the meaning of religion? Do not renounce everything. This renunciation is also an act of distrust. This thing will pollute me. This thing will contaminate me. Do not grasp anything, because you're then exercising sovereignty over it, limiting. Do not renounce anything. Do not grasp anything. Just be yourself, whatever the situation you find yourself in, and have fun. Vilas. The essence of this Dharmic tradition, right? We have a beautiful temple here, and it's always striking to me that in any Indic religion, Hinduism, Sikhism, Islam, Christianity, the only common route to that experience of incandescence always happens to be music. Right? It's the Bhagavad Gita. It's the Geet Govind. What did Guru Nanak do? He sang. Right? Because in some senses, what they wanted to capture was that sense of playfulness, that sense of being utterly comfortable. Now, if you begin with this perspective of faith, then you can actually see what the crisis of faith is. Right? Like our air, like our water, I'm speaking now of India, in some senses, faith is being burdened, is being polluted, is being made heavy. Why is it being burdened and polluted? Look at its manifestations. There's this great line from the Mahabharata. Draupadi says, Dharmo rakshati rakshata. Contemporary political uses of that line interpret it as saying, you have to defend your faith. But if you have to defend your faith, you don't actually have faith in the world. The meaning of the line, Dharmo rakshati rakshata, was, if you do your thing, have faith that God will take care of the rest. It's exactly the thing Goddess Kali supposedly told Vivekananda at Khir Bhavani, right? When he breaks into this sort of, torrent of torment about how could these temples have been destroyed. And Goddess Kali says, is it my job to protect you or your job to protect me? So that's in a sense the first dilution of that faith, that hubris. That in a sense it is we are the doers and protectors of the faith. That sense of I and egotism, in a sense that comes in that presumption. That our faith needs us to protect it. That's both a sense of distrust in the world and a basic, articulation of egotism. There could be no bigger articulation of egotism than that. And if you look at the crisis of faith around us, almost all religions, that's exactly the crisis of faith. And by the way, this happens everywhere. In the transition from Christ to Paul, in the transition from Muhammad to Ali, in the transition from Buddha to his disciples. Right? Two things almost always happen: schism and that sense of being comfortable in the world. I mean, one of the missing things about whether it's Christ, whether it's Nanak, whether it's Kabir, whether it's Ramakrishna Paramahansa, is the extraordinary sense of mirth and laughter they have about the world. If you can't laugh at the word, you can't transcend it. But that is what Gandhi, for that matter, I mean, Gandhi's jokes are always stunning. Precisely because it displays a sense of self that is completely at ease at every aspect. So that's one sense in which our faith has become polluted. We, in a sense, think we are larger than creation and larger than the universe. Right? Faith is supposed to say we are not the ground of our own being. This conception, this politicized conception of faith is now tells us, no, we are actually the ground of faith. Right? There's a second sense in which I think you might say faith is, at this moment, I think, dissipating, why there is a crisis of faith. That in part has to do with the challenge of religious plurality. In all our contexts, whether it's the United States or India. Religious plurality places two burdens on our sense of faith. It places many kinds of burdens. The most important one being how do we deal with people of other faiths. But existential, it places two burdens. One is it raises this question of whose faith? And of course, every religion is the hallmark of almost every religion in its organized form, that it claims its own superiority. Indic religions sometimes claim they don't, but in their practice they do. Where the minute you say Sanatan Dharma, right? The minute we actually say Indic religions, as if Christianity and Islam are not as Indic as anything, we have indicated already a sense of exclusion. There are rare souls. Think of Dara Shikoh, for example, Majma'ul Bahari, which articulates the point for you cannot understand the Quran without the Upanishads and the Upanishads without the Quran. The minute you think of religion, your religion as the property of your group and your identity, you've in a sense lost that religious influence. Anything should be anybody's to pick up anywhere. And it ties back to that point about individuality. We all find our way to that incandescent experience, each in our own way, each in our own time. Now, one of the things about dealing with plurality, and I think this is really fundamentally at the heart of this crisis, it's been my experience, saints of any religion don't fear saints of other religions. Because what they have in common, a common ground, is a sense of possibility that ultimate ground of our being, that religion can, the experience of the transcendent, if you want to call it that, is something that is a possibility for all of us. It's a shared ground. It's only when you don't believe in that possibility that you start and get stuck in theological disputation. And theological disputation is ultimately a play of words. One of the great features of the Indian tradition, not just the Indian tradition, but any true religious tradition, is that the central category in it is not theology, it's not dogma, it's not instruction, it's not precept, it's not even philosophy. It's experience, anubhav. Anubhav is that empirical ground that gives you that confidence. Yeah, and just as I'm seeing this chair, I mean, why should I have to doubt this? It's only when I don't have that ground that, in a sense, I feel the need to engage in theological disputation to define who's superior, who's not superior. Amartya Sen talks about this great Indic tradition, the great debates between the Buddhists and the Brahmins, like the argumentative Indian. But one thing we often forget about that great tradition. Both sides had a common ground, and the common ground was You cannot even have a debate if you don't know what it is that you're arguing about. That's the condition of the possibility of a debate. So unless you posit the possibility of that anubhava or that experience, the rest will all be, in some senses, a rhetorical play of words, which is really, in a sense, what theologies and schisms have reduced religion to. Which is why the saints will always emphasize. If you're not experiencing it, that's fine. That's where you are located right now in the structure of your experience. So we are much better able to deal with plurality if, in some senses, that presumptive ground, right, that this is ultimately will be adjudicated by experience, is something we all share. Plurality also poses a second kind of burden, and particularly in social and political context. This is a very parochial American debate, but you can see versions of it as well. All of our religions have their own histories, they have their own pasts, and those histories and pasts have to be represented. Right? They have to be represented in textbooks, they have to be represented in popular culture. Those histories also have to reckon with the history of oppression and untruth that is also sometimes at the heart of these traditions. Christianity has been persecuted. Hindu texts have legitimized a vile form of hierarchical oppression. Islam has sometimes licensed exclusivity. These are just quotidian facts about the ways in which religions work. No matter what one thinks of Christ, Paul is dogmatic. No matter what one thinks of Guru Nanak, right? One of the most astonishing figures in the history of genuine faith. Right? There is no question that by the time you come to the 19th century, the SGPC and formal organized Sikh religion becomes much more exclusive, much less Catholic. Now, both of these questions, the fact that our history is being represented to other people, and that we have to come to terms with our own past, makes us as members of particular communities extremely insecure. Oh, your religion is being recognized by President Biden, mine is not. Right? Or this textbook will say Hinduism was associated with the caste system. And everybody in class will look at me and say, you were associated with the caste system. Now, this kind of you might say, a problem of representation in a social context that is inherently competitive makes the adherence of most faiths insecure. And that's where most of our battles are now fought. I mean, what are my battles in Hinduism and America? I don't see a Vivekanand coming here like he did to 19th century America and saying, America is the land of Dharma, this is the future of Vedanta. Right? The battles are now, what is the California textbook doing? Which candle will President Biden write? If he writes the Hindu one, is it the Jain and the Sikh? Genuine faith is completely cool with the word. So in multicultural context, some of this is inevitable. Obviously, look, sometimes there are egregious representations of religions that allow people of other communities to stereotype you. But it's a common problem everyone faces. And a confident dialogue on that would not be a dialogue that either negates the past or the evil associated with organized forms of that. Right? Nor does it disguise the fact that this is actually a common problem. I mean, think of the Hindu stereotypes of Muslims and Hindu stereotypes of Christians. In different contexts, we also deploy them. Now, what exacerbates this problem is, of course, that there is a kind of political investment in some senses deepening these schisms. Because in part, political power always flows through communal organization. Communal organization always presupposes that you close the circles of your allegiance and identification, right, to the particular group that you actually in some senses belong. So this challenge of plurality in some senses, producing another kind of crisis. There's a third kind of crisis of faith, which is characteristic of modernity in some ways. And again, this is common to all religions in the world. And I would argue fundamentally the deepest kind of crisis. If you think of traditional religion, right, it's not just a matter of beliefs. It's not just a matter of experience in some ways. Anubhav, that will almost entirely be individual. It often sustains a sense of community, right, and vibrancy by being able to give meaning to and control the rhythms of your daily life. The morning acquires a different significance. If you begin with Venkatesh Suprabhatam, Uttishto Uttishtista, Uttishta Govinda, it's not just about waking up the God, it's about waking up yourself as well, right? Now, the brutal fact of the matter is that under conditions of modernity, more and more parts of our daily social existence cannot be governed by the calendars and rhythms and teleologies of this life. Right? Thankfully, nobody wants the world to be governed by Hindu division of labor. Nobody in the world, or fewer people in the world think that interest rates should be set by Aquinas' restrictions on usury. 90 to 95% of our embodied existence, we've actually, in a sense, emancipated from the dictates of those religious rhythms. Where does religion matter to us more? It matters in the realm of beliefs, it matters in the realm of private ritual, and it matters in the realm of civil society, collective spaces that. But that almost always raises this haunting anxiety. Am I being a true Hindu, a true Muslim, a true Jain? If you're a Jain engaging in commerce, you have to actually wonder, right? What does that actually mean? I mean, how do you square that radical renunciation and ahimsa with the rhythms of your daily life? How do we compensate for that? The mark of our genuineness then becomes not the struggle for producing integrity and harmonizing different aspects of the life. The mark of our genuineness becomes the intensity with which we can express our identity. And that intensity has two advantages. One, it actually shields us from difficult ethical questions. Because those we've already given to secular morality, those we've already given to an instrumental logic. Right? And it's a test we think we can control. Garv se kaho hum Hindu hain. What does that mean? Does it involve a dissolution of egotism? Does it involve a inoculation against collective narcissism? Does it involve an inoculation against treating other people in exploitative ways? Does it involve giving up an instrumental attitude to 95% of the things we do? I mean, Garv se kaho hum Hindu hai, take Christian pride. Easy solution to this problem. And so it's the shift in some senses from a form of religion that where you think there's a kind of internal social integrity to a form of religion where it's just loud declaration. Right? It's public displays. Let's construct the biggest Hanuman statue ever. Right? Fine. I mean, so you think that's going to get you Hanuman? Okay, right? As opposed to trying to say, okay, how do we get this genie booty to everybody else? That might be a more interesting proposition. Now, in a way, if you take all of these crises, the crisis of, in some senses, plurality, the crisis of modernity, where we are actually unable to give an account of our religious lives that actually harmonizes with what we mostly do for our living. Right? And this fundamental hubris that it is I who am here to protect my faith. I am the ground of that faith, not that that faith is my ground. Right? You have the makings of a perfect storm. Now, what happens as a result politically, and this is the kind of last theme I'll close with, is look globally. Putin's Russia, Narendra Modi's India, Christian evangelicals in the US. There are certain striking commonalities to the politics those religions are practicing in their public manifestations, in their dominant public manifestations. The first commonality is an obsession with demography. Right? What is Hindu majoritarianism about? The Hindus are a majority, it's a demographic concept, nothing religious about it, nothing spiritual about it, nothing faith-based about it. Right? And this majority must retain political power. It's a purely demographic concept. We were just talking about the possibility of, birthright citizenship being removed in the US. At the heart of it is fundamentally a demographic design. Mr. Putin banned all kinds of proselytism, entirely a demographic design. Now, it's a very peculiar conception of faith. It's a very peculiar conception of faith that says, we will identify faith by your demography. And frankly, all of these attempts to unite different schisms and all of that, I actually find them theologically, politically, I must say I'm instinctively suspicious of them. Because fundamentally it's about demography and power. The more we band together, the more power we will have. It's one thing if it comes together organically through the kinds of, in some senses, spiritual dialogues and conversations that we talked about. Nanak united it. Just look at the Guru Granth Sahib, right? But there's an organic context of experience that makes that vision plausible. When Ramakrishna Paramhans, spontaneous, he had no problems with Brahmos or Vaishnavas, with Muhammad or Christ, because there was the point of Anubhav and experience. But all other attempts to organize, they're purely demographic. The more we are, the better. There's no way of escaping it. Right? The second thing they have in common, so you have demography as this reducing religion to demography, reducing religion to ethnicity almost. That is what Hindu majoritarianism and Hindu nationalism is. It has nothing, absolutely nothing, I say that with a capital N, to do with dharma or dharmic values. There's only one D it's interested in, that's demography. And the power that comes with uniting that demography. Right? I mean, they couldn't care less about Ram or, Tulsidas or, and which is why it has produced this incredibly corrosive aesthetic of power. But, Putin's the same thing. I'm interested in the Russian Orthodox Church, right? Not because this is a very tragic interpretation of original sin or Saint Augustine, right? But because this will allow me to fulfill the demographic destiny of the Slavic people. The second thing they have in common, the increasing and complete alignment with political power. Now, I grew up in a Jain Vaishnav household. If one wants to name it, I mean, my parents would get very upset even if we name who we are, because that name is limiting. It already creates a schism before there is one. But the first thing every saint we met taught us was, if you find a religious leader or religious figure who is unwilling to speak truth to power, especially when it comes to the matter of violence, that's 100% sure sign that they're betraying their faith and they're betraying their religion. And just ask yourself the simple question. And this is now big danger to dharmic faiths, a big danger to Hinduism. Is there one major religious figure left? You can name whoever ones, the new age ones, you can name the old ones, who has that courage to say that in this dharmic space, this earthly sovereign, whether it's Narendra Modi or Putin or Trump, is not sovereign. Who has the courage to say, we can have our disagreements and disputations, in human beings, we'll argue about lots of things. But the minute you target any community simply because of being who they are, and you legitimize dog whistles against them, you betray your faith. The deep crisis in dharmic faith is not the assault from outside. Most of us who have confidence in the faith are actually fine. That actually only invigorates in some senses. It's never been the outside. We used to think it's from the inside because people used to think, there are schisms and, there'll be traitors and, there'll be jechas. Even that's not actually the real issue. What you're witnessing right now is the most radical reorganization of Hinduism in its history. It's going from a religion of play to a religion of organized violence. It's going from a religion. Right? When the Raja used to enter the Gurukul, he had to keep his weapons out. Now our Jain Munis sit in Vidhan Sabhas and, put a stamp of approval on power. Now the pontiff of the church, the Russian Orthodox Church puts a seal of approval. Of course, it used to happen in the Crusades as well, but that's exactly what. And I must confess, the reason I'm frightened about India, not external things, not economy, those things are repairable damages, is the first time in my lifetime I do not see a single influential Hindu voice that has a touch of exemplariness about it. Right? That can either speak truth to power or draw the line at violence. You can't get more corroded and you can't get more unfaithful. That's the ultimate form of egotism, right? In some ways. But by the way, this is true here as well. Right? When you think of, we used to think of Alexis de Tocqueville used to always make this point about America that democracy was in part successful because religion allowed a certain kind of social consensus over which politics could dance lightly. What did he mean by that social consensus? That most of what it takes to form a character, where does it happen? It can happen in three places. It can happen in public schools through education, civic education. It can happen in families, or it can happen in religious institutions. Now in India, it's not happening in any of the three places. We were never committed to creating common citizenship through public education in the way that the US, with all its faults, at least tried. Right? Families is where most moral education takes place, and those are at the cusp of incredible historical transitions. Conflicts around identity, around gender roles, which have inhabited all societies. And the third side is, in a sense, religious teachings. And just ask yourself, what is that religious teaching now in 8:4? घर से कहो हम हिंदू हैं. In the US, people are surprised. We always used to think that, you could disagree with Christian fundamentalists, but they would look at a figure like Trump, they would look at the decimation of institutions and the utter lack of integrity in certain sections of the political establishment. And they would at least say, at least this is not Christian, right? Some kind of restraint. May not be the restraint you and I want, but, right? Where is it? It's almost dissipated. Right? So, in that sense, and to me that signifies fundamentally that this religious politics exhibits this deep crisis of faith. That now it says the only way we can redeem is ourselves is if we just latch on to power. That's the only sign that our faith is successful. Now we are sitting literally under the feet of Lord Vishnu and Shiva. This is a Shiv Vishnu temple. Both an example of, in a sense, creative syncretism given the schisms around Shaivism and Vaishnavism, particularly under the Cholas later. But, as we were taking, as we were doing darshan, the best definition of dharma, right, was kind of embodied right there. You all know about Lord Vishnu's Kachap Avatar, becomes the tortoise to support the mountain so that it doesn't drown while the ocean is churning. And while the ocean is churning, in this kind of conflict between Asuras and Devas, all the poison comes out. And Lord Shiva comes and absorbs all that poison, right? Nilkant. The simple definition of dharma is who is going to do the job of absorbing that poison rather than creating it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. But if he hasn't provoked you, I don't know what will, okay? But I'm going to lead off with it's a leading question, but it's one that has come from many people over the course of the last 30 days when we told them that you were coming here. And they said, based on his writings and the teachings and his experiences in India, is it Dr. Mehta just anti-Hindu?
Okay, that's actually a very deep question. I mean, to be honest, I think it's probably the deepest question you can ask. So let me give you two answers. One a boring sort of metaphysical one, and then maybe a slightly more political one. Again, since we are in this temple, I think all these references keep coming. I think we went up there one afternoon aarti, 12 o'clock aarti was going on, and there's a line that always strikes me from the Venkatesh Suprabhatam. I mean, I just mentioned it at the beginning of the talk. I always used to stop kind of dead, whenever that line came on, particularly Balmaldi Krishna was singing it. Uttishta Tuttishta Tushtista Govindam Garuda Durja Dharmangya Trailokyam Mangalam. That's what it is, right? Asking Lord Vishnu to wake up and Tino Loko ka Mangal Trailokyam Mangalam. Now, I've always taken that to be the essence of not just Hinduism, but everything. Let's try. It's the Mangal of all creation, goodness of all creation. And we will, if we are held accountable at all, we will be held accountable for, right, what did we contribute to creating that one. Now, who should hold us accountable? Certainly in civic sense, our fellow citizens can hold us accountable. But this question of, are you a good Hindu? Are you Hindu, anti-Hindu? This is a question between me and Lord Vishnu, me and Lord Shiva, me and Christ, me and Pegambar, this is not a question between, in a sense, me and everyone else. I mean, I'm not even clear what that actually means, right? But the more political portion, here, let me be direct about this. The premise of that question actually exemplifies all that I was trying to incoherently say, which is that we have come to identify the in as allegiance to that demographic project of political power and allegiance to the idea that there is one political party or one single individual that uniquely represents the interests of what it means to be. And it's that conflation is now constant. You criticize the BJP, you're anti. You criticize Mr. Modi, you're in some senses anti. But it's even deeper. It's even deeper because remember, this is also a crowd that called Gandhi anti. Right. So let's be clear. This is I'm, be extraordinary hubris to put oneself in that genealogy, but the structure of the discourse. Okay. So the very premise of that question, I am a sinner in all kinds of, you can indict me for all kinds of things. But if the only thing you're worried about is that I'm anti-Hindu, right? Then I'm afraid you've not indicted me enough. You've let me get off very lightly. And I'm also afraid at the same time, you're also probably not taking your own Hinduism seriously.
I'll come to you in a second. I want to take you to the US for a second. Because one of the reasons that you're able to live this life where you're teaching in India, writing in India, coming here, teaching in Princeton, doing other things, is that you bring a perspective to faith here. Not just Hinduism in America, but other religions. And the conversations we've been having about the connection, as you see it, between faith and politics in India, Russia, United States, and what's degraded. So the question for you is, as you have come back after, I'm sure, some period of time given COVID, and been in America now for 6 months or 5 months, do you see that same conflation here? Do you see the same normalizing of a lack of civic discourse? I mean, because maybe some of us see it, maybe not everybody agrees with me, but we see a lot of that conflation happening here. So I'm just curious, do you see it? Do you see parallels? Do you think one is following the other? One is ahead of the other? Who's smarter at playing this game of faith and politics?
I mean, this question would require a whole seminar, but
we'll have another one on it.
I think one quick way of thinking about this is if some of what I've said made any sense, then there's a kind of common structure to the problem. As I said, I indicate, for example, the demographic story. There's a second part of the story, in some sense, which is deeply common, which is the logic of modern constitutionalism in line with the kind of differentiation that modernity produces. At one level is deeply individualizing. It emancipates the individual, not just from the state, but in some senses from a necessary identity and coercion. In fact, that's the great promise of freedom, and why I, for example, don't like these labels. Once you say Hinduism, you're already imposing a necessary identity. You've already said there is a script. You must conform, right? Now, one of the consequences of the centrality of freedom in modern constitution is that there are certain kinds of things that people care deeply about and genuinely care about, which are also deep and genuine moral issues. But it is hard to constitutionalize them or institutionalize them in a form of collective life simply because people disagree about them. So in the US, the obvious example is abortion, which we are seeing in some senses in Roe v. Wade. Right? In India, you can think of different kinds of examples. I mean, again, you have the Lord Ayappa here, the Shabrimala. Right? Now, we can argue the constitutional ICC, but fundamentally, the structure of a kind of collision between a set of values that says, look, in some senses, modernity is about freedom and the most expansive possible self-definition, which will sometimes also invade the space of right? That conflict is pretty endemic. And it's not accidental in some senses that US and India were the two democracies that were there when we thought actually religiosity was kind of quite high by historical standards. The US was not Western Europe, although I gather in the last 10 years or so, religiosity. So at that level, these conflicts have in a sense been very much part of, I think, the American political scene, the American constitutional fabric for a long time. Roe was not settled itself. It was there was an accommodation that was created that was going to be vulnerable, right? So that's one general, I think, debate around the nature of constitutionalism and the relationship between freedom and collective religious life that we see common to all constitutions. I think the second commonality, as I said, is the conversion of the anxiety about Christianity into a demographic anxiety. This kind of subtle conflation between Christianity, race, whiteness, Protestant culture, in different ways, or at least an American version of that culture. You can see parallels with Hindu majority. Right? That in some senses there was a cultural ethos to this country that was defined by its ethnic majority. Right? And remember, the important thing is that the content of the ethos is not that important. It's the fact that it was the majority defining it, because the content changes over time, right? There's a subtle kind of anxiety around that. I mean, Sam Huntington in this book, Who Are We, had warned about this like 10, 15 years ago in some sense, that America is going to lose its distinct cultural identity. In India, that's kind of reformulated as Hindu majority. That somehow the demographic entitlement of this majority is going to be taken away from it by Islam, by modernity, by anything foreign. And frankly, in both places, it's a deeply exaggerated and contrived anxiety. I mean, the idea that anybody stopped Hindus from practicing the faith, I honestly, the fact that people can even make that argument with a straight face is just mind-boggling, right? And shows a certain kind of lack of confidence, where what you are actually compensating for is, in some senses, your own inability to give an account of the internal integrity of your own project, right? And it's just easy to blame it on, in some senses, everyone else. The third commonality, which is the left and the center will always split, and the right will always stay united. No matter what the other contradictions, because it's united around a single point agenda, which is how do you use power to further a particular culture. Very simple agenda, right? Everybody else has very complicated agendas. I mean, there's, and in some senses, the right has grasped that the expression of your religious success is actually the possession of power. People will stop caring about. So it's almost as if people will stop caring about your religion if you don't have power, which already shows there's a certain kind of crisis. Right? So in some ways, now there are differences in party structure, in the depth of institutionalization, federalism, and so forth. But I do think there is a kind of common challenge these democracies are facing, which is there are interesting parallels, I think, in some ways.
Thank you. Prasad?
See, I'd like to ask you what you would offer or what you would tell Native Americans who, you know, in some sense had a sense of religion that went well beyond their local consideration of you know, what they saw as as matters of faith. So, you know, what we find is that they have been essentially eliminated. You see things like that happening elsewhere. In South America, it's a different dynamic. So, you know, the kind of message that you're trying to offer, how would you communicate that to a Native American?
Question was
About
just Native Americans and the sense that they are being eliminated and what the parallels might be to other such indigenous groups, perhaps in South America.
No, it's actually not quite that.
It's not.
You know, you say that you don't have to defend your faith because faith will defend itself in a sense. If it has value, it will persevere. I think historically, this is not borne out by experience.
Yeah. No. I get it. You know, no, it's again a very, very deep question. So, I think there's a couple of distinctions. I think one needs to, which is there is no question. The picture you are painting is an accurate description of how history works. History is a slaughter bench with lots of peoples, in some senses, vanquished and eliminated, right? And it's also a slaughter bench where the slaughter is, in a sense, has been legitimized in the name of progressive ideologies, in the name of religion. Let's not disguise the fact that the association with Christianity and empire, and even eliminationist empire, was quite deep and significant, right? Absolutely, right? So, as a descriptive proposition, the fact that yes, you need forms of organized power to protect yourself is, I don't think as a political scientist I could actually call it with that thesis, right? But in a sense, now flip the question around, and that's the perspective from which I was talking. Wouldn't you also want to say to the Christian who legitimized that eliminationism, or at least stood silent in the face of it, what compassion, what kind of conception of caritas this is, where the vitality of your faith requires the elimination of somebody else's. See, from a first person point of view, right? You can look at, you're looking at it from the point of view of the outcome. If you're looking at it from the point of view of the cause, right? What are the conditions under which religion becomes exclusionary, discriminatory, genocidal, communal? Right? Because the question we were asking, the panel was in a sense the faith and politics. I was looking at it from the side of faith in some ways. Right? The conditions under which religious ideologies become all of those things, right, are the conditions under which that faith begins to say it is its job to conquer the world. The conditions under which it begins to say that the test of my success is not transcendence in some senses kingdom of heaven. It is actually the assertion of power. How do I know Christ is on my side? By measuring the number of people I can kill. Right? So, I actually don't think what I'm saying is incompatible with In fact, in some senses, you might say it's a different aspect in foundation. Now, obviously, when you are faced with such a process, it's natural that societies will have to organize themselves, right, to defend. And then that's an argument often made in some ways. But the question then is, what is the basis of that organization and what is the objective? Is it purely defensive? Is it in some senses pushback? What values is it invoking to, in a sense, engage in that defense? So I actually don't think there's anything I said that's incompatible. It's if you look at it from the perspective of faith, what are the conditions under which faith becomes exactly the kind of thing that can provoke communalism and genocide stuff? You have to actually then, then wonder about the nature of that faith. There's nothing in what I said that says that we are political creatures, we live in organized societies. That if you're faced with the possibility of immense oppression, that you actually don't organize yourselves to, in some sense, defend it. But what you're not defending there is not, in some senses, I'm defending my God, or that God has given me the license, in some sense, to exercise sovereignty over you. What I'm doing is a very simple human act, which is our relations require reciprocity if they are to be genuinely human relations. If you're come to cut my throat, there is no reciprocity here. And I need power to the extent that I can, in some senses, enforce that reciprocity. So the grounds on which you fight also matter as much as, in some sense, the tools you use to fight.
My name is quick. Pleasure to hear you. I was listening to you while I was driving, so I heard everything you said. I've been in this area for quite some time, part of the diaspora. I just want to congratulate the organizers that it's actually from what we would call the progressive side of the diaspora. To see you speak at a temple in the United States is an achievement in itself. So congratulations to the organizers. The first two questions were softballs, so I'm going to give you a hard question.
Sure.
I'm kidding.
I also said the first was a softball.
And the last question was a tricky question because my understanding of your question is that you think that Hindus are under Hindus have to be, act like the Native Americans.
Can I explain?
Yeah, please.
I don't know if the format you had accommodates.
Because I think that's a very important question.
Yeah.
Well, I firmly believe that if you don't defend what you value, you will lose it. And I think that is one of the lessons that Krishna tries to communicate to Arjuna, in a very strange setting, and took a long time to say it. But the fact is that he asked him to defend what at that time was the dharmic issue at hand. That's my reading of what happened.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that if you don't defend what you value, and if you don't develop the methods and tools to do that, you will lose it. I don't see any way that you can avoid that. That's all. That's what I'm saying.
I want to hear the answer to that.
Yeah. Why don't you add your question? We can do it together.
Yeah. I mean, these methods and tools are really at the core. These methods and tools are really at the core of the problem. As you identified, that this is not a religious experiment. This is an exercise of demographic advantage, right? So my question, I mean, obviously I want to hear your response to that methodology part because, I'm influenced by Gandhi methodology. It's very, very important how we progress forward. But I had a separate question. As you laid out the almost existential challenges that Hinduism is facing today in light of the demographic project, And you mentioned that there's really no voice or hardly any voices that are speaking truth to power. And I know one, you right here, and there's a few people I know. What is your conception from a design standpoint as to how either those voices are amplified or organized or are coming together? Are we looking at a theological left?
Yeah.
And does the theological left have to start off at a point of culture and then migrate to the political realm, or does it have to have both dimensions from the get-go? So it's a design level
Yeah.
question, because that's where we
Yeah.
are. I mean, is there a Martin Luther situation? Or I don't want to have a John Brown situation. Harper's Ferry is not far from here.
Yeah.
So yeah, just curious to know how you see if something has to take shape.
Okay, so the two questions are actually interestingly related, at least, which is the first step, right, is what are the values that we as a society are trying to defend? And let's take it axiomatically to be granted. I mean, we can rewrite history, we can rerun history, 1,500 different ways. That contemporary India, and this was sort of that great kind of the great Vivekananda Aurobindo project, and I can talk why Vivekananda Aurobindo failed, and perhaps even Gandhi to some extent, was saying, look, we are going to create a new social contract. The core of that social contract, which you can define both in secular terms, but each religious person will also recognize it defined in their religious terms. This is a project for guaranteeing individual dignity to every single individual, so that they can make the most of this life in whatever way they choose fit, and to the highest forms of spiritual perfection that they are able to find in their own way. That's, in a sense, the core of the modern constitutional project. Of course, it requires a bit more than that. It requires the material conditions where we have not done as well as we hope to put it mildly. But that is, in a sense, the core. That is the value. Now, those values, of course, will have to be defended. And when we say defend, the one thing Gandhi was right about, which is exemplarity is a large part of how we defend. Defense is contextual. I mean, you could argue Gandhi's debate with Martin Buber over Hitler. Is there somebody who will be so immune to any form of moral motivation that at some point you say, look, you just have no other option but to defend yourself? That's certainly possible. Right? But the first thing, in a sense, I think in the context of modern Indian learning, what is it that we are trying to defend? The projects where we invoke Krishna's name in vain. Krishna was trying to defend Lok Sangrah. He was not, I mean, at least if you interpret it in this kind of broadest sense. And to be honest, we also know what happened. I mean, Mahabharata is not a story of a happy ending. It is a story of total collapse. I mean, every time that episode is evoked, we must remember Mahabharata ends in Draupadi's and Gandhari's tears. It does not end with the Pandavas' victory. Right? I mean, is that where we want to end up? Right? So the defense part is exactly, it is a political, and we have to be very clear that in part, a lot of it, like in the US, we can give a more sophisticated. Modern democracies raise questions of power in different ways. There are different groups. How is power going to be shared? If you completely marginalize a group, if they cease to see a democracy as reflecting their interests, are you setting up a deeper political problem? Right? It's a very practical question of power sharing, right? That, If you create a constitutional structure where somebody fears they can be targeted simply for being who they are, you're actually not going to be defend any value. You're actually just setting yourself up for the conditions where you will end up in conflict. The lesson from the Mahabharata, in some senses, I mean, Mahabharata is a big text in some ways, right? Is the Bhagavad Gita comes in only at one particular point. When in the sense that the ship has sailed the port in some ways. Krishna knows that this is, I mean, I think in the Mahabharata, Krishna is somebody who's seeing the apocalypse coming. The point is the prior point, which is if all of us start thinking like Duryodhana, it's me or nothing else, then where do you end up? That's the point of the Mahabharata. And in fact, the Gandhi was right to draw that lesson, which is not, I mean, not in the sense the lesson of non-violence, is that if you don't first answer that question, which is if we all end up thinking egotistically like Duryodhana, now magnified simply because it's a form of collective narcissism, then actually even Krishna's organized power will not be able to save you. The Abhimanyus will die. That's the narrative of the Mahabharata. How helpless power is it actually in that text? Because it fails to answer that prior question. Dhritarashtra, right? Partisan affection in the king. Duryodhana, right? It's my sovereignty or nothing else. Bhishma and Vidur, who knew every single text and every single Shastra silent. That's where we are right now. It's not, whether we need to organize our power or not. You have to, once you reach the point of the Bhagavad Gita, the game is already over.
So what are the tools?
Sorry.
I'm just
I got you.
This is like you set this up to have a say. Abhimanyu would probably be in jail, under UAPA.
Right.
The way this is going.
Yeah.
So,
So-
but
So to coming down specifically to your question, so I mean, it's a question we're discussing in the US as well. There's a lot of talk these days about, politics is downstream from culture. So do we begin at the culture level first and it translates into politics? We often get this charge about secular constitutionalism that it doesn't speak in Indian idiom. You should tell Ram, Krishna, Duryodhana stories and the constitutionalism will become more robust. I'm actually a bit skeptical of that view. Not that you shouldn't be doing that. I mean, as free citizens, you want to do that. It's, it leads to creative interpretations. That's perfectly fine. The reason I'm skeptical about that is diagnostic. The Bhishma and Vidurs in every society knew the Shastras, right? So there's one lot who knows exactly why targeting particular groups because they're for who they are is actually wrong. But the other reason, which is that we have to understand that a modern society, if it's going to be stable and moderately just, all it requires is just a very basic courtesy of reciprocity. I mean, this is my favorite story. Prashant has probably heard this many times, but I even at the risk of repeating myself. So I was once in a discussion with several members of parliament from different religions and also in different political persuasions. And each of whom was, very exercised about somebody has said something offensive about my community. So this wasn't freedom of expression. Sayan has painted this is offensive to Hindus, why are people offending Muhammad? So everybody. And then the pet argument was that secularism doesn't work in India, it's a Western concept. Liberalism is a Western concept. Right? Now, the West was almost never secular and almost never liberal for most of its history. Still is only imperfectly so. It's actually not clear what that claim is. But the second claim, which is the simple one, which is all of us at some point in our lives use a very simple argument. Sometimes our children use it with us, right? Don't impose something if I have not agreed to it. Right? It's not part of who I am. It doesn't comport with my anubhav, my sanskar. You know, simple argument. We use it all the time. All that building a common ground that constitutional culture requires is just extending that courtesy to everyone. It's not a particularly deep or alien argument, right? If you have the right to worship, we have the right to worship. If you know, now, in that sense, I mean, I'm agnostic. Of course, that cultural work needs to be done, a certain kind of idiom. My own diagnosis is that I think, like with the US in some senses, we have to look at what led to the downfall of that secular political project, let's broadly call it. One was, of course, its own hypocrisies and inconsistencies, which is, you know, which pretty much everybody has been saying since the 1980s. It's not the BJP suddenly woke up. In fact, they've used, I mean, arguments, constitutional arguments. Many people around here have in some senses made. The second was the social base, right? I mean, there is no question that it became very easy to project the Congress party as a plutocratic parliamentary party. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to be able to do that. Third is, in a sense, divisions, right? Where you still have you know, if you just went by a kind of social base, demographic electoral base, you still have immense possibilities for pushing back this. But the kinds of political coalitions that you could form, and there one has to do some inventive electoral work. There's no way around it. I mean, you know, if we think we can avoid politics or avoid electoral politics, operate only in the realm of culture, I don't think in a modern society, in some senses, that you know that's going to that's going to work. But I think from an intellectual point of view, because that's really all, in a sense, speaking, is there actually needs to be a clarity of what is that common ground that is actually implicit in all these different claims that you can actually get people to share. My worry about these cultural arguments is that they're almost too metaphysical. With all due respect, it's like the way dharma has become metaphysical. It's this monumental block hurled at everyone, right? This is all the details that matter. Right? You know, it could be things like India does need, for example, a much, I think, deeper consensus about the narrative of our own past, an honest way of talking about our history. Again, parallels with the United States, right? I mean, the fact that you can have a 1690 project and a 1776 commission. I mean, it's the US's equivalent in some senses of, you know, our debate over medieval India. Right? Now, in those realms, I think the work of culture needs to be done. But here's my, I think, plea, and this is, I think, both a religious plea and a secular plea at the same time. If the way you are going to treat your fellow citizens and what rights you think they should have is a function of you getting your culture right, I think you're in deep trouble. I think that has to have some very elemental sense of reciprocity and that shraddha, out of which then you can have a kind of much more interesting conversation about, you know, what that culture in some senses should be.
Dr. Jain, Vasu, and Pratap.
Sorry, Dr. Sushil Jain. It's not more of a question. It's more of a seeking. We heard this, and your last comment is real perfect segue into the next generation. That we're losing. Don't force your view on me, and if you do, I will vote with my feet. And that's what's happening in North America as well as in India, and it doesn't matter what religion or faith you're. One of the biggest challenges that we face between you and Romina Madam, I had a chance to read her writings as well in Delhi. And one of the things that we face is how do we inspire the younger generation to return back to the places of worship before their age 55 and 60. Because when that enlightenment occurs, we all migrate towards the temple for our enlightenment. But we lose that generation between the college and their professional development. And that's a huge gap. And in that gap, a lot of inconsistencies, like our religious leaders running around as politicians wearing our costumes, as you just alluded to, that they're wearing our religious clothes as monks or whatever, and Jains are not behind.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that the Jains are being endorsed by that. And same thing with our Hindus or any others, that we don't endorse that type of political involvement, but they do it, and the 90% of us at Janet. So I think what we want to do is focus perhaps in the next 4 or 5 minutes is how we can inspire the problems of today.
Oh, wow. That's a, so actually you partly gave the answer to your own wonderful question. You know, again, this is an old story from political science, but I think is still valid, which is one reason to keep religion and politics separate is if you align them too much, when the disillusionment with politics sets in, it will also rebound on religion. So when young people see all these gurus, they actually see the same marketized, plutocratic, corrupt figures that they see in their politicians. Why would they come? They're being perfectly rational. To be honest, it's the only thing that gives me hope that they are actually exiting and voting their feet. Because what that at least suggests to me that they're not, in a sense, overtaken by this instruction and propaganda. Now, I agree with you that that can represent a loss, both for them and for the community, which is that, you know, that are there forms of knowledge that in some senses they're not, you know, they will gravitate to that only if there's a sense of exemplarity and excitement. It's not going to happen by instruction. I mean, you know, in school we always used to joke that the surest way of making us immoral was having a moral science class in class, right? I mean, that's not how education works. I mean, absolutely, you know, in some senses it doesn't, work that way. Now, by exemplarity, I mean 2 or 3 different things. I've used that word a lot. One is, of course, figures that inspire, where they have a reason to trust someone. Honest truth is, if they're drifting away, it's a question we 50-year-olds need to ask about ourselves. That why do they see? I mean, young people naturally see, you know, as you grow older, your tolerance for hypocrisy and inconsistency grows suitably higher for obvious reasons. But young people are clearly seeing something about our lives that they don't find exemplary. Right? Exemplary in a second sense, which is, how do you actually create forums where you can even begin to have that dialogue, which already does not prejudge the answer, right? Often when forum, and this is a rare exception, but often when forums like these are conducted, I've seen that in India all the time, there is somebody saying, okay, here's a dharmic point of view, I'm going to, you know, discriminate. We should be open to the possibility of being changed by them radically. Because that's what genuine seeking in some senses is about. Right?
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but one of the other things that we do face across globe is interfaith marriages and the family concepts. And that becomes a challenge, whether do I go to Shiva Vishnu temple or do I go to this Christian or do I go to Jain temple? And then the couples struggle in many ways. And they both will say, well, you know what, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. So we will teach our children what values that we have, and we'll find group and small parcelas in our homes rather than
no,
because we don't create an environment of it. Sorry.
I mean, that's in a sense exactly right? Which is that our attunement to what inviting people who've grown up in a pluralist society, and interfaith marriages in some sense is the most intimate example of Although from the interfaith couples, we've seen all kinds actually. I mean, in some ways, that itself is a kind of enriching negotiation in some ways, right? Where you just have to be attuned to that fact, right? It strikes me, just rereading some of Vivekanand stuff when he came to America first, right? Besides the kind of the homage to America in some sense Vivekanand constantly gives, is he's wrestling with both idioms. When he's wrestling with, in a sense, an idiom that's recognizable. Yeah, that's the kind of problem. But he's also recognizing that you will have to think of humanity in a different context and the relation between collective religious identity and humanity very differently in the modern world than we did. I mean, the matha, the community, as frankly, I mean, it is the brutal truth, but it's actually easier for some senses, most of us, to actually walk into churches because of the nature of the liturgy and the nature of the services, right? They're actually temples. One of the exhilarating things about them, they are actually extremely individualized in some senses, but they're actually not often structured, even in their day-to-day liturgy, to actually be a kind of, sort of collective. Most kids, for example, who grow up in America, because America is a much more earnest culture than India, they actually, want a text. I mean, you never ask, no kid in India ever asks in a marriage ritual what the Pandit is saying. Somebody's come from America the minute they say, what's the meaning of this? What's the meaning of this, right? But actually, if you think of our collective experience of temples, it was all in a sense based on sound and collective effervescence. It actually doesn't have, in a sense, that textualized sensibility that actually is much more second nature to these kids in some ways. In some ways, and it's not that, I mean, there is more demand for text-based classes, for example, but where they struggle is then connecting it back, right, to what the lived form of life they're going to lead. And that's not easy guidance for any of us to give.
We take
We do have one on one.
and we do have one.
So you talked about unity consciousness in the beginning. So there is a statement by one saint in Uttar Pradesh. So spirituality begins when religion ends, and reality begins where spirituality ends. It's a very profound statement. Most people don't get it. So this kind of viewpoint was there in Hinduism, still in existence in Hinduism today. That I feel that there are some polarization in India today, but still the fundamental ethos of Hinduism is plurality, tolerance, still very strong in Hinduism. So I feel that if you come up with a framework starting with that kind of a understanding, it still resonates with many Hindus. You will have much more chances of success in bringing those things together. Another question I have for you is, are you universal civil code? That's another. So for every Hindu intolerant, there are always Oasis and Shekar Narasimhan and the other side of. So how do we balance both them? Come up with a framework where the Hindu-centric ethos is still resonating in a lot of Hindus. How do we come up with that kind of framework? Your language might draw some people because as Shekar said, the perception that people have is that if you're too much to this side, then you're not resonating with the center where the plurality and tolerance is still existing.
Okay. Thanks for that. I mean, so I actually agree with you. I mean, I think both the textual and the vernacular resources, vernacular meaning accommodations that have been worked out in actual practice, are still resources to draw. I mean, we would all have given up long. We wouldn't even be having this discussion if we did not think that was, in some senses, a possibility. But I think two things you said which are very important. One, since you mentioned uniform civil code and stuff, I think it's important to lay this on the table. And again, why I think the culture argument only does very little work. As I said, modernity and modern democracies generate particular kinds of problems. I mean, in an old empire, nobody talks of uniform civil code. In fact, its mode of religious toleration is separate, segregated people. I mean, the Ottoman Empire perfected it, the Mughal Empire perfected it, the Mauryan Empire perfected it. You have your own mutts, you have your own, customs, you can even have your own customary law. Even at the local level, you can have your own customary law. Partly because those states do very little. They're not developmental states, whatever else they might be. They don't need to. So long as you're not challenging the king and the rich are paying the taxes, they actually don't care. So long as you're broadly acknowledging the stability of political authority. Modernity in that sense, and that's the paradox of a liberal society, is that it actually makes toleration harder. It makes toleration harder because it's a society of mobility. In older societies, each community has its place, but it's a very well-defined place. There are even interactions. People often trot out these examples. We celebrated festivals together, our economic relations of economic interdependence. But those are fairly structured relationships. I mean, they flow along particular channels. What modernity does is, in a sense, it actually makes the problem of toleration much more intimate. Right? Now you have to sit with the non-vegetarian. Now your kids might be marrying somebody from another faith, or at least going to school with them or college with them, and various things will happen. Right? And what we often find, I mean, this is good historical work. Asim Roy's great work on Bengal, 19th century Bengal, that you find that even areas which were the most syncretist formally in culture are actually the first to collapse under this pressure. Because you're going from one form of toleration. Modernity requires a very different kind of toleration. It's a toleration centered on individual freedom. It's not a toleration centered on respecting just respecting group identity. It's also linked to the common civil code question that you asked, because the one way in which we secure freedom is freedom requires two things, right? So you have to secure our freedom from being oppressed by another community. You have to secure our freedom from being oppressed by the state. But you also have to secure the freedom of individuals from being oppressed by their communities. Right? And the contradiction often in people who claim and spout tolerances, they're willing to claim the first one. Oh, the state should not impose anything on us because our community is not agreed to it. Well, the same logic should apply to individuals within the community, which is why a modern society cannot have blasphemy laws, which is why a modern society cannot have any laws regulating interfaith marriage. And now, to that extent, and this is a project we certainly failed on. I think we did not frankly discuss. I think the direction of modern constitutionalism will place burdens on all religions, right? To ensure that whatever these norms and laws are, they correspond to this basic confection of freedom that is at the heart of human dignity. Now, whether that necessarily has to take literally a common civil code, or it can maybe in a sense take another form, which in a sense always been proposed, which is that isomorphically, a lot of the laws of the different communities pretty much look alike each other, and there's been a lot of progress in that direction. But there may be some gray areas which don't fundamentally impinge on people's freedoms, which could be. Now, the problem there, the challenge is that this is a genuine political issue and a legal issue. This is not a legal and political issue that can be solved simply by throwing culture at it, which is we were dharmic, we were tolerant, right? Absolutely, right? But what it does require, where culture does help, is creating the conditions where you can do this dialogue in good faith. It's not a pretext. What has happened to it, and I can agree that Congress was hypocritical. But what has happened under BJP's is it becomes a pretext. True, the second point also is that there's fundamentalisms in every community. I mean, my general rule of thumb, I mean, maybe this is a consequence of growing old, but whenever you have large numbers of people, you will have a fair distribution of different kinds of people, right? So you will find, and it's true that Muslim politics in India has been historically let down by the kind of leadership it has produced. It has also been let down by the kind of leadership we encouraged it to produce in some sense. We meaning the structures of Congress party. You just have to read Hamid Dalwai's book on Muslim politics in India to, right? Absolutely. But the question is, can we create a context of this dialogue where the starting premise is not, this is a competition between communities? Because that competition has no stable equilibrium. The only stable equilibrium will produce if you have a blasphemy law, we also need a blasphemy law, right? The fundamentalists of both sides will say we are happy regulating interfaith marriages, right? So we in a sense have to get out of this trap, right, of attaching freedom to that community identity in ways in which, lots of these plural state spaces don't open.
For example, would you be in favor of removing 4 wives
So here's the brutal truth about it, right? Empirically, as we know, bigamy and polygamy was empirically as prevalent in Hindus as it was amongst Muslims. The proportion doing it was actually very small. There was, by the way, no resistance to it, right? It should have been done a long time ago. There has, as you know, there's a Muslim women's group, personal law board, that has been all articulated a very different and progressive conception of Sharia for years. And who has kept the monopoly of the Muslim personal law board, right? Who has investment in it, right? Congress certainly did. So I think on this there is no disagreement, which is any modern constitutionalism has to conform to norms of gender equality. I mean, there's just now the bad faith, right, is that every community uses that argument when it's convenient for beating up somebody else, but it does not use it when it actually, let's say, comes from freedom. So you have to test the sincerity of the commitment to that proposition, right? But yeah, I mean, yes, any constitutionalism that liberates individual from the tyranny of a compulsory collective identity, I'm absolutely for.
I'm going to let Parga, and then we have a question.
It was similar.
Was similar? Okay. And then Pradeep. And then
I'm going
we'll
to keep
have
it very short because I'll continue the dialogue after the meeting with you. I really appreciated your point about faith being about exemplarism, someone to look up to, whether it's theism, whether it's a god, whether it's a leader. And I was also struck by your observation. The right kind of stays together, it's the left and the center that get fractured. And in light of that, in your comment on demography, yes, and many dharmic religions, probably exception of Buddhism, do not proselytize, do not convert. So there's obviously an inherent, I don't want to say deficit because I think it's a great trait, but you don't have that. As an educator, then I'm thinking, so what is the solutions to these things? What is the person am I creating? Am I creating the discerning person who knows that faith has nothing to do with religion? It can be, but faith is that attribute that we know to look up to that exemplary figure who believes those values you're talking about that I would say is dharmic values, whether it's Jain or Hindu or whatever. And that's where I'm at, and I know you don't probably have an answer to today, but I would love to keep the dialogue going on. So where are we headed? Now that we have political scientists saying, here's how we keep creating the messes that we have. And here is why that causes the mess. How do we learn from it so that we teach differently, we are different, so we inspire that next generation to be those exemplary leaders if we have not managed to be. So I know it's a question that's large, but that's so thank you for evoking those thoughts.
Thank you. That's actually a great challenge to end with. I look forward to learning from you. We should talk more on this.
Pradeep? And then I'll just wrap it up.
Is it on?
It is on. Thank you so much. I want to go back to your point about the crisis of modernity, which is also leading to these impulses. As India urbanizes, as more people migrate, we have seen electoral patterns which suggest that the BJP becomes strong. So are we now locked into a somewhat irreversible process where as modernity deepens, the crisis produced by that modernity deepens, and therefore the political strength of the right increases? A second related question to that is the link between Hindutva and state power.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the theme of the discussion, which is faith in politics. Now, this ideological current has been there for a century. It has accessed state power at times, but it has never accessed state power in the form that it has in the last 8 years. And that has given it both power and virulence. Do you see that as irreversible too? That even if it continues to enjoy state power, there will be this very explicit and pronounced form of politics and disturbing politics that we see at the moment. But even when it is outside state power, this ideological current now has in some ways so irreversibly shaped in society that it's going to be hard to counter.
So those two great questions. I think the first one is, I think, much more complicated because to be honest, I don't think we can say with confidence that we know the sociological preconditions under which certain forms of religion or religious politics flourishes or not. So for example, there is an argument, Ronald Inglehart, the great scholar of religious values comparatively, his last book, where he's actually discussing this paradox of why is religiosity declining for the first time in America. And he actually makes this argument, and the data certainly bears a lot of it out. But as you know, data tells you yesterday's story, it may not tell you tomorrow's story. He actually makes this argument very powerfully that there are lots of countervailing trends. So there's urbanization. But the critical thing to watch is actually fertility rates and the emancipation of women, which always leads to a very radical transformation in forms of religiosity, right? Partly because home-based ritual becomes less important. If everybody is working, you don't actually have that, a certain kind of that home space which was subject to a certain kind of rhythm becomes less possible, right? Questions of individual freedom come up in a very, very different way. And in some senses, reactionary politics almost everywhere is about gender. Now, the BJP is complicated because it has very rightly and quite skillfully, and this is something Mr. Modi has, I think, thought through, better, which is that you're in a kind of contradictory dimension in India, which is on the one hand, you had a large group of women and women voters who just were simply neglected, not even considered political agents, even these myths about they don't want independently, right? As political scientists contributed to a lot of that mess. And it's reflected in his interest in things like sanitation and gas. It's very hard to argue with actually. The scandal is we didn't do that for so many years. Now, how successfully he's doing it or not, we can debate. But the three things, Jal Jeevan Mission, gas, and sanitation, are actually about gender politics, I think, in a sense, creative way. But in some senses, you might say on the flip cultural side, right, which is regulation of women keeping them within the religious fold, Shabrimala, it's a very complicated case. So right now you can run these two things together. But at some point, I think these tensions are going to come out. So I think you're going to get a lot of countervailing sociological stories. I think as education and mobility and stuff, I think changes. the point about Hindutva and state power, I think, is very important. So look, one, I think, historically, the longue durée, of course, it's not the case that Hinduism has not been associated with state power in some sort of, conceptions of kingship or Hindu. And I think even the tradition from, let's say, out of which Yogi Adityanath is coming, the Nath Sampradaya, I mean, after Gorakhnath, it was always politically central. I mean, my hometown Jodhpur, 19th century politics, you cannot understand without the centrality of the Nath Sampradaya, this kind of warrior monk in some senses, warrior in this sense, right? It's a strange fusion in some senses of yogic power and kingship power that has been central to some of the yogic and tantric practices and actually thinking about the nature of power. And all the stuff about brahmacharya and all feeds into that stuff, right? What is unprecedented, what is in a sense new, is this commitment of the Hindutva project to, in a sense, inscribe Hindu majoritarianism into the very fabric and structure of both the constitution and administrative practice. So look, in the realm of culture, this stuff could go on, people have different ways, and that's the beauty in some senses of a great constitution. It allows people to tell different stories, right? In some ways, the religious, the secular, is it irreversible? I think two things. One, it's certainly going to get worse, much worse before it gets better. I must confess, I have not seen the kind of communalization of India in my lifetime that I see right now. This is even with reference to the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. It feels more like the late 1940s, 1930s, 1940s, both in Europe, if one wants to use that hackneyed analogy, but also actually in some senses in the Indian subcontinent, where the disquieting story is you had the Gandhis and the Nehrus and the Tagores and the Azads, and you still could not prevent a communal Holocaust of extraordinary proportions, right? And the reinforcing momentum from so many different sides, right, is really quite striking. Frankly, gives us the nightmares. But what makes it worse? So we've had communalism as a stream. In emergency, we had authoritarianism as a stream. Now you have the perfect conjuncture of it. So it's not simply, okay, we want to target particular communities and scribe certain laws which could be reversed. We are going to completely remake the institutional fabric of the state in ways in which the basic protections you took for granted, are no longer going to some sense of obtain. So, I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but we edited the Oxford Handbook to the Indian Constitution. We can't tell you what the Indian Constitution is. As a journalist, you're not protected by habeas corpus. If you were working in frontline in UP, Prashant, you probably would not be sitting here, right? We know what's happening in Kashmir. We know, and the kind of alliance between state and capital, which is also very unprecedented. I mean, Indian capital never challenges the Indian state. I mean, every budget is 10 out of 10. That's perfectly fine. But similarities with here. This attempt to, in some senses, create and control an information order and a surveillance order of a very, very different variety. Right? So we are in completely uncharted territory. Now, if the kinds of resources that were said exist, then you would imagine at some point there'd be some kind of resistance. The fact that they're doing by stealth makes it more effective and more insidious. And by stealth, I don't mean that it's not visible. Everybody sees what's going on. By stealth, I simply mean do it incrementally in a way which 80 to 90% people say this is not going to affect us. Right? By which time, in some senses, it's too late. Which was the strategy here in some senses, right? Which is you instrumentalize every institution to the point that it has no institutional credibility left. And I fear the next frontier will be the Indian Army, which was the last bastion of or, of that kind of at least consensus credibility.
And just to wrap it up, but to say provocation is a mild word for the last couple of hours. Lots of thoughts racing through, but I want to end on a slightly hopeful note with you, which is that when we started, what you said is that faith is personal, that if we all learned that and not religiosity, that we could actually change things. And what I will tell you is that in the generation that has grown up here, that is exactly how they feel. And the question is whether they can harness that, and if they understand the threats fundamentally to a constitutional order, to democracy, to their way of life, because it has to become personal, whether that can be mobilized into, in fact, the kind of voting coalitions that through the electoral process can make the difference and separate again religion and faith and politics, so that we end up with faith only. So I would like to end with that as a hopeful note, and believe and hope that you will help us in continuing to be that voice of reason. And I think, as well said earlier, truth's power. Thank you so much, Dr. Mehta.
Thank you.